Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russia says Ukraine launched drone attack on Moscow region overnight. Russian President Vladimir Putin says North Korea's firm support for Russia's war in Ukraine emboldens the two countries as he thanks leader Kim Jong-un. Plus, scores of Ukrainian sappers clear out of Russian mines as minefields stall Ukrainian advance in the east and the south. Thank you for joining us. We begin with the Russian Defense Ministry. They say they destroyed an unmanned aerial vehicle that Ukraine had launched overnight to attack the Moscow region. In a statement on Telegram, the ministry said an attempt by Kiev to carry out a terrorist attack by unmanned aerial vehicle on facilities in the Moscow region have been foiled. It also adds that the UAV was destroyed by means of air defense. The mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, also confirmed the attack. There were no casualties or damage. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry reported that progress has been made in the direction of Krasny Liman, while Ukraine claimed the Russian side is conducting military drills to block the Black Sea. According to the defense ministry, the Russian army advanced nearly 3 kilometers in Sergiev in the Luhansk region. In the past day, the Russian army repelled the Ukrainian attack in Donetsk, Kupiansk, Kherson, and other directions. Amongst them, in the direction of another location, the Ukrainian army launched an intensive attack with 3 tank battalions, which were repelled by the Russian army. The General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces said that in the past 24 hours, dozens of battles occurred in the frontline area. The Ukrainian Air Force, rocket launchers, and artillery units attacked the concentration area of Russian military personnel and equipment, electronic warfare equipment, and air defense systems, destroying a Russian Ka-52 helicopter and military multiple drones. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense Press Center said that Russia has strengthened combat training for the Naval Surface Force and Air Force of the Black Sea Fleet. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine believes that Russia is intensifying its drills in an attempt to block the Black Sea. Scores of Ukrainian sappers are training to clear minefields in the southeast Zaporizhia region, tasked with clearing out tens of thousands of Russian mines in order to allow Kiev's troops to advance in their long-touted push to recapture occupied land. The sappers also have to worry about booby traps, bombs, and mortar rounds. According to the sappers, it's impossible to use mine detectors because the entire area is covered with shrapnel. Ukraine launched its counter-offensive in the occupied south and east early last month, recapturing a string of villages, but no major settlements thus far. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Ukrainian attacks had intensified in recent days, primarily on the front line running through Ukraine's Zaporizhia region. Speaking on the sidelines of a Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg, President Putin said that Ukraine had not enjoyed success on any part of the front. He said, in his words, without any exaggeration, I can say that our soldiers and officers have shown the best examples of mass heroism. All attempts to wage a counter-offensive have been stopped. The enemy was pushed back and suffered large losses. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin says North Korea's firm support for Russia's war in Ukraine emboldens the two countries' determination to cope with Western groups. He made this known in a speech to North Korean officials on Thursday. President Putin did not go into detail of the nature of Pyongyang's support in what he called Russia's special military operation, but U.S. officials said last year that North Korea was selling millions of rockets and artillery shells to Russia for use on the battlefield in Ukraine. The Russian leader's speech was to offer congratulations to North Korea on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the Korean War armistice, known as the Victory Day in the North. President Putin said in his words, the historic experience of combative friendship has noble values and is serving as a reliable foundation to further develop the connection between Russia and North Korea in the field of politics, economy, and safety. President Putin also wished North Korean leader Kim Jong-un good health and achievement in his work for the well-being of his people, according to the KCNA, a news agency. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky visited a damaged cathedral in Odessa. The visit happened after Russian forces had struck port infrastructure in an overnight missile attack, killing a security guard and damaging a cargo terminal. The president also paid a visit to a medical center in the city where Ukrainian soldiers underwent physical rehabilitation. The Ukrainian Presidential Press Service said President Zelensky decorated military and civilian medical workers during his visit. Meanwhile, President Zelensky also visited Dnipro in southeastern Ukraine to discuss the situation on the battlefield, supplies for troops, and how to strengthen air defenses. The Ukrainian president said, as always, in his words, we pay close attention to the supply of ammunition to our troops, the efficiency of using the existing air defense systems, and reinforcing the Sky Shield, taking into account supplies from partners. The region, an important economic center in southeastern Ukraine, is not far from the front line and borders Kherson in the south, Donetsk region in the east, and for the north, the Kharkiv region. Dnipro city, capital of the region, had a pre-war population of about 1 million people and has become a logistical and humanitarian hub for Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion on February the 24th. Now let's talk to Mr. Dinas Reva, researcher, Institute for Security Studies, who joins us from Pretoria, South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
The recent visit of Sergei Shoigu and the Russians to North Korea, though it's for the armistice celebration, has other connotations. And President Putin has alluded as much that this situation is giving them an occasion to become closer. Is there a danger that this conflict in Ukraine will indeed drive countries on the other side of the divide, such as North Korea, such as Cuba, such as Russia, such as Nicaragua, closer together when more diplomatic means could be employed to pry them apart?
I think we should definitely expect attempts by Russia to form these partnerships. One of the things we're observing currently is a lack of sufficient amount of ammo and munition and missiles, rockets on the fronts in Ukraine. So Russia is quite desperate to find these supplies from around the world. And of course, North Korea is one of the few countries that uses the Soviet standard munition. I don't think that we should expect North Korea and other countries to actively participate in this war. Although, of course, we've seen reports that apparently North Korea considered sending some volunteers to fight in Ukraine. I don't know how seriously we should take these reports. But overall, I don't think we should expect these countries to participate actively in the war. I think there are a lot of risks involved, and not just for the country itself, like North Korea, for a country like China, for instance, that may not be very happy with North Korea taking an active part in this war or being involved. But we should certainly expect Russia to try to build these partnerships and to try to utilize these partnerships. And of course, when there is an opportunity to make money, be it Iran or North Korea, these countries would happily supply munition, drones, and other equipment to Russia.
From where you sit, do you concur with President Vladimir Putin that this counteroffensive has been stopped by the Russian defense of the areas they've occupied in Ukraine?
I think it's a bit too early to say. Of course, you would expect Putin to come out and say that Russian side is victorious. This is also not the first time he said it. If you take the total equipment that Russia claims they destroyed from Ukraine, it's times more than Ukraine ever had. So we should take it with a grain of salt. I think it's important to remember that Ukraine has prepared, I believe, 12 brigades for this offensive, and they've so far employed 4 out of 12 of these brigades. So until we see the full force being deployed on the front lines, I think it's too early to say whether the counteroffensive has succeeded or failed. We can see certain movements on the front lines from the Ukrainian side, certain successes. We can also see that Russia is successfully moving on the Kharkiv axis. But it is certainly too early to say whether the offensive has been successful or whether it has failed. There are some reports that are emerging now that Ukraine is preparing to deploy or has started to deploy the full force for a breakthrough on the Zaporizhzhia front. So it's certainly too early to tell.
Maximizing the use of Russia's superior numbers militarily-wise or military-wise is obviously a strategy that the Russians employ. And now with them reducing or increasing the draft age so as to bring some more people into military service in Russia, is something obviously the Ukrainians have to take account because they don't have those numbers. Do you think their military strategy is sympathetic to the lesser numbers of military personnel that Ukraine has in their military strategy?
Well, interestingly enough, we haven't seen a mass deployment of troops by Russia so far. There were attempts, you may remember, the first time Russia attempted to draft people into the military, and there was a tremendous pushback from the society within Russia. It was an extremely unpopular move. With all the recent developments within Russia, it does seem that they are preparing for another round of mass mobilizations, as you mentioned, extending the range of ages that are being involved in this. At the same time, the nature of modern warfare is such that there is a way to arrange your defensive positions and actually dig down and defend. You can see it happening currently with the Ukrainian counteroffensive, how difficult it is for the Ukrainians, despite amassing overwhelming number of troops, to move forward through the minefields and defensive positions. Of course, if Russia does conduct a general mobilization and bring more people to the front, it will present a tremendous challenge for Ukraine, and it would be tremendously difficult for Ukraine to match these efforts. But at the same time, we need to remember that Russia is already suffering from logistics problems, supply problems. So if they proceed forward with mass mobilization, they have to arm these people, they have to feed these people, they have to provide clothes and other equipment for these people. And I can't see at this moment in time how they would manage to do that without actually making additional efforts to modernize, well, rather to direct their economy towards the military efforts. It will be very difficult for them.
Russia is courting the global south with this Russia-Africa summit, not the first time. Obviously, it goes without saying that the Ukrainians would have loved that the African leaders even boycott this Russia-Africa summit. But our president, vice president, that is Kashim Shettima, is there in St. Petersburg. Who's there on behalf of the South Africans? And what's your position on neutrality on or support for Ukraine, or maybe even for Russia, on the part of African countries as this summit is underway?
Well, it's actually quite an interesting summit in the sense that the first summit attracted more than or around 45 presidents and top leaders from African states, the summit that took place in 2019. This time around, the number of leaders attending is actually down to 17. So we see that, at the very least, African countries seem to be a bit cautious in terms of how they engage with Russia and not to be seen as taking a side or tipping the balance.
We do apologize. I think Mr. Riva just froze for a second. We beg your pardon for that glitch in the broadcast of his views on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We'll see if we can reestablish contact with him. There you are.
I think I'm back.
Yes, please go on.
Yes. As I was saying,
yes.
What is quite interesting is that the number of people that Russia actually expected, over 40 leaders to attend, only 17 attended. So this is an interesting sign and quite unexpected. I don't think Russians themselves expected a low turnout of African leaders at the summit. At the same time, what's quite interesting is that 5 countries outright decided not to attend this event, Kenya being one of them. And Kenya, of course, is an important player in East Africa. So overall, it's the summit itself is, I would say, is not reaching the marks, the objectives that Russians would hope it would. But nevertheless, of course, it's an important platform for Russia and for African states too to engage with their counterparts in Moscow and to discuss some of the relevant security and food security issues. But it's definitely not performing in the way that Russia would expect it to perform.
Do you think, Mr. Riva, that the countries such as Central African Republic and Mali, who have the operations of the Wagner mercenary group in their nations, will use that opportunity to clear the air on the position of the Wagner group and President Putin's support or not interfering with the Wagner group's operations outside Russia? Do you think this is a concern, especially in the case of the CAR, where the group is instrumental in helping them achieve some sort of stability for the ruling government?
I think most certainly this is a good platform to have these sort of discussions, especially because it is not quite clear what exactly will happen with Wagner and whether these operations that were conducted by Wagner in Africa will be continued by Wagner, or whether Russia will take over with more traditional means. I think there is certainly, and it has been communicated before, there is certainly a commitment by Russia to continue their support to these African states, to Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, among others. They're ready to continue these engagements. I'd imagine this is tremendous. This is definitely a good opportunity for these African states to get a reassurance and a commitment from President Putin that they will not be abandoned, and that whatever happens, Russia will continue with the support. And there's definitely an interest on the Russian side to continue with these operations.
Riva, Mr. Dennis Riva, researcher, Institute for Security Studies, who joined us from Pretoria in South Africa. We'll continue to see what happens with this Russia-African summit, and we'll continue to hope that this conflict between Russia and Ukraine is brought to a speedy conclusion. Many thanks for your contributions and your insight this morning.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, UN Chief Antonio Guterres warns handful of donations can't replace Black Sea deal. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the So For More stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The White House says Russia's withdrawal from the deal that allowed Ukraine to export its badly needed grain has sparked volatility in grain prices. Speaking to reporters at the White House, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre says the Black Sea Grain Initiative have resulted in more than 32 million tons of grain being exported to rural markets.
Okay, Vladimir Putin. So first, the Russia's unilateral withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, as you know, which had been instrumental in reducing world food prices, as well as Russia's attacks on Ukraine's grain shortage and transportation infrastructure, have caused, as you know, significant volatility in grain and food prices. The Black Sea Initiative had resulted in more than 32 million tons of grain being exported to world markets. Russia's actions to take such a significant amount of food products off the world markets will exacerbate hunger in some of the hardest hit areas of the world, including Africa. So while we would welcome any actual contributions to alleviate global food insecurity, or to paraphrase what UN Secretary General Guterres said just moments ago, and I quote, a handful of donation to some countries cannot replace the millions and millions of tons of grain export that help stabilize food prices around the world. I did promise his mom that I would not keep him longer than a year. The onus is on Russia to show that it isn't an empty promise, if that is exactly what they're going to do. After all, they began the Russia-Africa summit with significantly diminished influence as a result of their actions, as we have seen, and more than half of the countries who had attended the previous summit are not attending this one, and so we'll see.
Meanwhile, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is warning that a handful of donations won't correct the dramatic impact of the end of the deal that had allowed the safe passage of Black Sea export of Ukraine grain for the past year. It comes after Russian President Vladimir Putin told African leaders he will gift them tens of thousands of tons of grain within months, despite Western sanctions, which he said made it harder for Moscow to export its grain and fertilizer. Now let's talk to Dr. Kunle Olawumi, retired Navy Commodore, head of the Department of International Relations and Diplomatic Studies at the Christian University of Abeokuta. Good morning, and thank you for making out the time to be with us.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Obviously, one of the issues on the front burner for the African countries at the Russia-Africa summit with President Putin will be this grain supply as it affects Africa. Now, there's been talk of alternative land routes called solidarity lanes through Bulgaria, mainly through Poland, using land traveled and trucks. There's been talk of using maritime corridors through the tributaries of the Danube as well. But this is certainly not enough, as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is pointing out. Should there be more of a priority or an imperative for a return to the Black Sea grain deal for these countries, including Ukraine, or should focus now be on seeking alternative routes?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I believe that the issue of the grain deal, I think, is being overhyped, indeed, because if you look at the global supply of grains, Ukraine supplies just about 5%, while Russia supplies close to 20% or thereabout. And I actually listened to the program yesterday where the Russian president was talking to the at St. Petersburg. He actually promised an alternative for Africa, because I think that is our concern. Is ready to ship grains, wheat to Africa free of charge. That is not going to have any shipping costs. I think that the Russian president is trying to do what I regard to as a global reset. Most of the hypes about the Ukrainian grain, the deal, I think is most of the Western media propaganda. I think it's not really as bad. So I think the alternative route is going to add to the cost of transport and the risk of passing through some of the frontline states. They're going to pass through some of those states. How safe are they? I think they are not really far away from Russian missiles as well. So I think we should not pay too much attention to the politics of the grain deal, particularly in Africa.
Mohill? But I want you to listen now to the, hold on, Doctor. I'd like you to listen, and our viewers to listen to what Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, had to say about it concerning the Black Sea grain deal. Take a listen.
It is clear that when taking out of the market millions and millions of tons of grains, it is clear that, based on economic laws, that will lead to higher prices than the ones that would exist with the normal access of Ukrainian grains to international markets. And this increase of prices will be paid by everybody, everywhere, and namely by developing countries and by the vulnerable people in middle income and even developed countries. So it's not with a handful of donations to some countries that we correct this dramatic impact that affects everybody, everywhere. We need to be pragmatic. We need to do things that are possible. And we are doing every effort we can to guarantee the access of both Ukrainian and Russian food and fertilizers to global markets.
Secretary General, should urge with China's interest.
Therefore, Dr. Lamy, so do they, A, focus on a return to trying to get Russia back to the negotiating table to restore the deal, or B, forget about Russia, throw the baby out with the bathwater, and focus on alternative routes?
Yeah, I think for Africans, I want to speak for Africans. The Europeans' politics and rhetoric on the grain issue is one way. The Russians will not allow such arrangement because they also supply wheat. I told you just now that the Russians produce more than 20% of the grain. The global share is 20%, while that one of Ukraine is about 5%. Russia is willing to reset the global commerce, and I think Africa should pay attention not to swing with some propaganda on this issue of grain. It's going to be more expensive if they are going to, open another corridor. The Black Sea is blocked, and Russia is making alternative, is offering us an alternative solution. So for Africa, I think we should just go to where it's cheaper and is going to benefit us. After all, what is our gain if we want to take side on this issue? I think we should remain neutral and get the grain where it is actually cheaper and easy for us. What is important is for Africa to be self-sufficient in food production. Though it's difficult not to take side in the kind of situation we are, but I think we should be pragmatic. And if Russia is offering us free shipload of grain, I think we should take it and leave the West and their allies to contend with other issues. We don't have any serious stake other than for us to be focused on our welfare and food sufficiency in Africa. By and large, I think we should also learn from this. Africa should try to be self-sufficient and stop going cap in hand all over the world looking for food. We have the largest land space, agricultural space. The AU, I don't really know what they do there. I think they should just put their acts together and leave the Western and the Asians to solve their problem wherever it's benefit us, that's where I think we should go.
Indeed, I'm sure many developed countries wonder why Africa is not yet food sufficient. Food for thought, Doctor. Now, during the Vietnam War, one of the horrors of that particular enterprise was the way the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong at that time, used to booby trap their own country and suck the Americans in with horrific traps and booby traps and mines that left people without limbs, without legs. And up till this day, you have people who have relatives or even people like that from the United States who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's a very terrible thing. In the case of Zaporizhia, where the sappers, as we reported this morning, the Ukrainians who are trying to demine that area, find that there's so much shrapnel and they can't do that effectively and efficiently. What's your impression? And I feel for both sides on this sort of trench warfare. What's your position on this concentration of these two sides, especially with the cluster munitions on this trench warfare, the use of mines, and now the introduction of booby traps and the cluster bombs and munitions?
Yeah, I mean, this is war, and every side wants to have an advantage. For me, if you study the Second World War, the First World War, we have situations like this, even outside the Vietnam issue, where the Germans, encounter something like this, and they develop what they call the maneuverist approach. They call it blitzkrieg. What the Ukrainians should do, because I watch and I'm so perturbed with their tactics, why should you continue to move on a front that is hardened? They should take alternative routes. If that place is hardened, then you should not continue to move in that axis. There should be alternative for them, because the amount of mines the Russians have laid there is just to tell you that they are not really interested in moving forward, but they want to maintain their position. So they are actually initiating a stalemate for the Ukrainians, bogging them down, while the Russians have opportunity to open another flank, as I said. And look at what they are doing in Africa. Look at what they are doing in Asia. Outside the battlefield, outside the theater of operation, the Russians are doing extremely well. Look at how many countries they've lined up. And I think the West should begin to think outside the box. The Russians are very smart. They just put mines everywhere and use long-range artillery and missiles. Once in a while, they use their fighter jets to just keep on making them busy. They are throwing in more ammo tanks. They are flushing them out. The issue of mines is something that will show you as a tactical commander that the enemy is not really prepared to move forward. So you now being bogged down at the minefield, trying to clear it, is going to be very expensive. So I think the Ukrainians should change tactics and leave the mines alone and conduct what I would call a maneuvering approach. You have to change mind in warfare. If you see that you have a challenge that is very formidable, what you need to do, if you're a very good commander, is to change tactics as well. If their only is to bog you down, then you should conduct what I call maneuvering approach. Blitzkrieg. Go through other flank, left flank, right flank of the minefield and achieve your objective. Nobody can win a mine. Even the next 50 years, you are still going to see those mines there. Let's assume that, okay, Russians have ambition. How are they going to navigate their minefield as well, even though they may have the map? So it shows you that they are not planning to move forward. So you should not be bogged down there. There are other objectives. Crimea is there. The northern part of Russia is there. So they should leave the minefield alone for now and use maybe air assets to clear them instead of this painstaking effort I've been seeing in the past few weeks.
That's the exact issue that is discussed concerning the air support that Ukraine has been asking for for the past few months and since last year concerning the F-16s. You mentioned World War II and the Blitzkrieg. I think that involved the German Air Force, right? So, am I correct? Hello?
Yeah, that was the concept of the marginal line. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, please go on. So my point now... Wait.
Yeah, it was the marginal line that was designed by the French, you know, a very fortified defense by the French to keep the Germans away. What they simply do, what they did was to just avoid the defense line and went behind the enemy lines and achieved the objective. It was the French marginal line concept of defense, which is what the Russians are actually doing as well. So I think the Ukraine should learn from the Germans and avoid defense.
So now, Dr. Lamy, that means that their counteroffensive and their defense is dependent on the supply of these military assets from the West and from America and from the countries that say that they will supply F-16s. But doesn't that then therefore now mean that this war will continue to be protracted? Because they're estimating as far away as maybe 6 months before they can get any F-16s and before the pilots can be ready and before the support on the ground will be ready for air support for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we've been asking for the past 3, 4, 5 months, that the air asset is very essential in this war. When we were talking about armor tanks and artilleries, I suggested on this program that what they need is air assets. Because if you throw in a lot of armor tanks, they're going to use long-range artillery, long-range missiles, rockets. They're going to use UAVs to knock them out. So it is overdue. The issue of air assets is overdue. However, this war cannot be won on the ground. The war cannot be won on the ground. No matter how much assets the West throw into that theater, it's not going to be won on the ground. This war will be won when the West are ready to negotiate. Or, as I've said before, when Russia implodes from within. And I don't know why it's taking the West so much time to be able to perfect the idea of making Russia to implode. This war is going to be protracted, it's going to be long. Even if you bring the F-16, I know tactically the F-16 cannot withstand the Russian fifth-generation fighters. So I don't even know whether that is going to be helpful. The Sukhoi series of the Russians definitely will outwit the F-16. And mark you, they're not going to give them the modern F-16. We're talking about F-22 Raptors, we're talking about F-35, and you're still talking about F-16, where the Russians, the opposition, have fifth-generation combat fighters. So I think we should not deceive ourselves that throwing in more F-16 is going to give any serious advantage to Ukrainians. The Russians have the capability to knock out those F-16s on the runway or even in their hangars. So I think we should begin to think of a better strategy, which I think is going to come through negotiation if the West are willing. This war is going to continue forever if you continue to train in more arms, more weapons. And I think that we should begin to look at the United Nations now. I don't know what they are doing.
Yes, Dr. Lamy, sorry, if I may jump in there. Sorry, if I may jump in there. That's exactly the point I want you to emphasize in your closing submission. Finally, to you, we have come to a situation where we can't see the forest for the trees because of all the fighting, because of all the aggression, and because of everything that's happening on both sides. Not many people are talking about mediation anymore. Where would you like to see a restart of these negotiations?
It's a very complicated issue. I've always told people that the price for the West is Crimea. That's the price for everything you are seeing here, the control of Crimea and the Black Sea. If you take the Crimea away from Russia, it's going to weaken them. It's going to be a difficult negotiation. And that's why I always suggest that if Russia can implode, maybe we see a respite. Negotiation, how do you negotiate Crimea out of this issue? The 20% they've taken, about 18% now with the effort, can be negotiated. That's the Donbas regions can be negotiated. I don't see how you're going to convince Russians to leave Crimea. And I know that is the price for the West. They want Crimea so that they can control the Black Sea, because whoever controls that Black Sea has a great strategic advantage. So negotiation, yeah, it's possible, but I think they should just maybe take out Putin or disorganize Russia in a way that they can break into another 5 regions. And I think it would be faster that way. Yeah.
Taking away Crimea, that's the hard sell in any negotiations with the Russians. Thank you so much, Dr. Olawumi, for your perspectives this morning on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've been talking to Dr. Kunle Olawumi, the retired Navy Commodore, head of Department of International Relations and Diplomatic Studies of the Christian Universities in Abeokuta. Many thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
When we return, Russia's world champion beach footballers pining for international return. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. And today is the second day of the Russian-African summit hosted by Russian President Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg. Addressing Russia's decision to withdraw from a UN-brokered deal to allow safe passage for grain shipments from Ukraine's southern ports and eventually to Africa, President Putin said that Russia can plug the gap, adding that Russia will be able to provide free grain to 6 African countries in the next few months.
African diplomatic delegations, including those from Ethiopia, South Sudan and Zimbabwe, have arrived in Russia to take part in the country's second Russia-Africa Forum. Similarly, the presidents of Central African Republic, Uganda, as well as leaders from Libya, the Republic of Congo, Cameroon and Burkina Faso joined other delegations for the summit in St. Petersburg. Meanwhile, Nigeria's delegation, led by Vice President Kashim Shettima, also landed at the northern city's airport. On the sidelines of the meeting, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi met with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. The gathering takes place days after Russian President Vladimir Putin quit the Black Sea Agreement that had enabled Ukraine and Russia, a major grain exporter, to ship food out of its southern ports, despite what Russia calls a military operation in Ukraine. Speaking at the start of the African leaders' meeting, President Putin says he wants to see the African Union become a full member of the G20 Club of Nations in September. Mr. Putin also says Russia can replace Ukrainian grain exports to Africa and supply 6 countries for free.
We realize the importance of an uninterrupted supply of foodstuffs to African countries. Therefore, we have always paid and will continue to pay special attention to supplying our African friends with wheat, barley, maize, and other grain crops, including supplying as humanitarian aid. We will be ready to provide Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, Central African Republic, Eritrea with 25 to 50,000 tons of grain for free, and we will ensure free delivery of these products to consumers.
The Russian leader says his country is expecting a record grain harvest this year and is ready to fill the gap for African countries, both on a commercial and aid basis, and honor what he said was Moscow's critical role in global food security.
Now our South African correspondent, Innocent Samosa, joins us now from Johannesburg in South Africa. Innocent, good morning. Whichever way you paint it...
Good morning.
Yes. With whichever brush you paint this picture, Russia seems to be looking good, that it even hosted and is hosting this Russia-Africa summit and has gone so far as to attempt to replace Ukraine's importance to Africa by free supply of grain. So is this a diplomatic attempt at pushing Ukraine to the side in the eyes of Africa?
Well, a very good morning to you, colleague, and it's good to be in your company. I like the way you put it. It's really interesting. Again, it seems as though the St. Petersburg is yet another stage for the Russian-Africa engagement. And of course, they are moving with this one under the theme technology and security. You would remember that in June, 4 African leaders went to Russia, tried to really calibrate some sort of a peace mission. And we understand that for that to take place, Ukraine had said that Russia would have to withdraw its troops, and we don't see that happening. But also, as you've mentioned, around the issue of food security, this comes at the time when Russia has pulled back on the Black Sea grain deal. And of course, you would know, Olumide, that the challenges around this whole conflict has really, put a knock-off effect on African countries, particularly when you look at the soaring commodity prices and the issues around the disruption of the grain supply. But speaking there, as you've just witnessed from that report from my colleague, he mentioned that Russia will be able to provide grain to 6 countries in Africa. And of course, he said that that will happen in the space of around 3 to 4 months. He sounds like he's convincing, but also, I guess, part of the things that they'll debate, it's investment also, peace and security, but food security, I guess it will top the agenda. And given the fact that some of the resolutions that were tabled in 2019, Olumide, they failed short. So I guess they would want to go back and revisit them and see whether or not they can resuscitate them. But it does look like they are in a good space right now. And it does seem as though these leaders are convinced. Listening to President Emmerson Mnangagwa yesterday, last night actually had a roundtable with business leaders. He sound convinced that he's indeed with backing Russia's military operation, but also he thanked Russia for what they've done in Zimbabwe. You would remember those helicopters, you would remember the scholarships also, and also the fertilizers. So he went as far as to thank the president of Russia. He was also part of that particular engagement, Olumide.
High-powered delegations from all the African countries attending. Despite the fact that our president couldn't make it, the vice president, Kashim Shettima of Nigeria, is present there. Did your president, Cyril Ramaphosa, make it to the summit, and what was the representation? Also keep in mind that this is the precursor, if you will, or if you like, to the BRICS summit.
100%, Olumide. South Africa is still trying to manage the relationship between, Washington, and it does look like our, perceived alignment to Russia has really cost issues around the AGOA extension. In fact, the Minister of Trade and Industry wrote to President Biden asking for an early extension for this AGOA process because he feels that we might have a challenge in terms of extending that. But issuing a statement from from the presidency, Vincent Magwenya, the spokesperson of President Ramaphosa, mentioned that there was no pressure for President Ramaphosa to attend the Russia-Africa summit. In fact, he said that the president was willing and he was happy to actually do that. But I guess the relationship, Olumide, of Russia and Africa, it should, in my view, it should go beyond the liberation struggle, go beyond, politics, and start yielding economic dividends. Because you would know that this issue, this Ukraine-Russia conflict, has really been challenging for many African countries. So it has to start to yield, positive results. But South Africa, it's still trying to strike a balance. They don't want to, seem as though they're aligning with Russia. At the same time, they don't want to seen as if they are with the West. They're in a very compromised position, if you like, Olumide.
Thank you, Innocent. Free grain from Russia to some African countries. They didn't tell us whether it's free now, but you have to pay later. Thank you, Innocent. Innocent Samosa.
Thank you, Colin.
Who joined us from Johannesburg. Many thanks. Finally, on the program, world champions in 2021, Russia's men's beach football team are unlikely to have a chance to defend their title in 2024, but the players and coaches remain hopeful they can one day escape the sporting wilderness and return to the international stage. European governing soccer body UEFA and global equivalent FIFA decided all Russian teams, national or club sides, will be suspended from their competitions following Moscow's decision to dispatch troops to Ukraine in February 2022. That applies to beach football. And while the ban is clearly negative for Russia, Captain Anton Shakarin believes the wider game has also suffered. Russia hosted and won a friendly tournament in St. Petersburg this month, beating top sides Iran, Senegal, and the United Arab Emirates, next year's World Cup hosts. Russian authorities argue it's discriminatory to ban the country's athletes and deprive them of national symbols such as their flag or anthem, but the players said they will jump at that chance to compete. And competing under a neutral flag is still up in the air for many of the sporting associations for Russia at the coming Olympics in France. Food for thought as we leave you for this edition of Russian Invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Many thanks for watching. Have a good weekend.